After a decade of dedicated work, he offered her a bonus that could have finally changed her life. She looked him in the eye and said no. What he discovered when he secretly followed her home would challenge everything he thought he knew about wealth, value, and who the real heroes are in our society. This is the story of Michael Thorne, a self-made tech millionaire, and Alina Reyes, the woman who cleaned his home every week for 10 years. It's a story about what we choose to value and the invisible walls built between two worlds living under the same roof. And it begins with a simple, baffling act of refusal that would force one man to confront a hidden reality flourishing in the shadows of his own success. For a decade, their relationship existed within the strict, unspoken boundaries of employer and employee. Michael Thorne built a fortune in Silicon Valley, his life a curated exhibit of success. Alina Reyes was the constant, quiet force that maintained its perfect order, every Thursday without fail, until the Thursday he decided to break protocol. It was the anniversary of his company's landmark public offering, a day marked by seven-figure bonuses for his executive team. Sitting in his minimalist home office, overlooking the city he felt he commanded, a thought struck him with unusual clarity. The person most responsible for the peace that allowed him to work, the clean slate he returned to each night, had never received anything beyond her agreed-upon wage, $22 an hour, for 10 years. He printed the bonus check himself, $50,000, a rounding error in his monthly dividends, but a sum he knew could transform a life built on hourly labor. He rehearsed the moment, imagining her stunned gratitude. It felt like a virtuous capstone to his own success story. When Alina finished her work that afternoon, he called her into the study. She stood in the doorway, her posture as always perfectly composed, her uniform spotless. He offered the check with a brief, rehearsed speech about gratitude and loyalty. Alina looked at the paper, then she looked at him. Her dark eyes held no shock, no gleam of sudden relief, only a profound, unsettling calm. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. This is too generous, but I cannot accept it." The silence that followed was absolute. Michael assumed it was a polite, initial refusal. He insisted, pushing the check toward her. "Please, Alina, it's the least I can do for everything." She took a small step back, her hands clasped firmly in front of her. "No, sir, I appreciate the thought, but my answer is no." The refusal was not hesitant. It was final. It was a wall. In all his years of high-stakes negotiation, Michael had never encountered a rejection so absolute, so devoid of leverage. He was a man who solved problems with resources, and his primary resource had just been declared irrelevant. He watched, utterly baffled, as Alina gave a slight, respectful nod, turned, and left his home, leaving the check lying on his desk like an unanswered question. For days, the interaction haunted him. It defied all logic. He knew her salary. He knew, in broad terms, the math of her life. She sent remittances to family in the Philippines. She lived in a modest apartment in a neighborhood his real estate app described as medium affordability with high commute times. $50,000 was a safety net. It was a down payment. It was freedom from a cracked transmission or a medical copay. To refuse, it was not just proud, it was irrational. Began to replay a decade of Thursdays, the quiet efficiency, the small, consistent touches, a always stocked particular brand of tea he liked, the books on his shelf dusted but never rearranged. She was a ghost in the machinery of his life, present only by the flawless results she left behind. He realized he knew nothing about her, not really, where she went after she closed his front door, what her voice sounded like when she wasn't speaking politely to an employer, what she wanted. The mystery crystallized into a singular, driving need to understand. One evening, acting on an impulse that felt equal parts intrusive and necessary, he did something he would have never previously considered. He waited near the window of his home office. He watched Alina get into her older, well-kept sedan, and he followed her. The drive was a journey into a different city. The sleek glass and steel of his downtown gave way to vibrant, crowded streets, then to quieter, older suburbs. She did not drive to the apartment building he had loosely assumed was hers. She drove past it. Her destination was a neighborhood of narrow lanes and compact, agging homes. She pulled into the driveway of a small, one-story house with a faded but carefully tended garden. This was not a rental. This was her home. Michael parked a discreet distance away, a knot of guilt and curiosity tightening in his chest. He saw her step out of the car, but instead of heading to the front door, she walked around the side of the house, disappearing from view. He waited for a light to turn on in a window. None did. After 10 minutes of silence, his curiosity overrode his restraint. He stepped out of his car and approached the property. What he saw when he peered around the side of the house stopped him cold. It was not a backyard for relaxation. It was a construction site. A small, single-story structure was rising from the ground. The walls were only partially finished, a patchwork of concrete blocks and wooden framing. Piles of sand and bricks were neatly stacked under tarps. And there, wearing jeans and a work shirt, her hair now freed from its usual bun, was Elena. She was not alone. She was getting the hands of a teenage boy, showing him how to mix mortar. Another man, older, was carefully laying bricks on a new section of wall. They were working in the fading evening light with a focused, shared purpose. This was not a home renovation. The scale was wrong. The shape was wrong. It looked like a classroom, a single long room with large openings for windows. Michael's mind raced, trying to reconcile the image. The meticulous maid who refused $50,000 was here, after her workday, physically building something with her own hands, investing not in a new kitchen, but in this. As he watched, hidden by the shadow of a neighbor's fence, a small van pulled up to the curb. The side door slid open, and a ramp was deployed. A woman in a nurse's uniform carefully wheeled out a young girl in a wheelchair. The girl's face lit up as she was wheeled toward the construction site, pointing excitedly at the rising walls. Elena immediately stopped her work, wiped her hands on her pants, and walked over, kneeling to be at eye level with the child. From his distance, Michael could not hear the words, but he could see the radiant smile on Elena's face, a smile he had never seen in 10 years of Thursdays. It was a smile of pure, unguarded joy. The pieces began to click into a terrifying, awe-inspiring picture, the refusal of the bonus, the quiet exhaustion he had sometimes mistaken for shyness. This was where her energy, her spirit, and her money went, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. But the full truth, the profound depth of her mission, was even greater than he could have imagined in that moment. And what he would learn next, the reason this school existed, and the specific children it was being built for, would not just humble him. It would dismantle his entire understanding of value, community, and what it truly means to build a legacy. Over the next week, Michael returned to that quiet street every evening, a hidden witness to a revolution in slow motion. He saw not just a building rising, but an entire ecosystem of care that operated in the shadows of the formal economy. And with each observation, the puzzle became more awe-inspiring and more devastating. He watched volunteers arrive after their own shifts, a nurse, a retired carpenter, a young man who worked at a hardware store and brought discounted materials. They worked under battery-powered construction lights until 9 or 10 at night. The project was named, he learned by overhearing a conversation, the Mariposa Center, Butterfly, a Transformation. Driven by a need to understand that now burned in him, Michael began a different kind of research. He hired a discreet, ethical private investigator with one strict instruction: gather only public information and community sentiment. No intrusion into Elena's private life. The report that landed in his inbox 72 hours later was a document of profound social failure. The neighborhood, Crestwood, was a transit desert filled with working-class immigrants. The local public school, built in the 1950s, was chronically underfunded and overcrowded. Its special education program, the report stated bluntly, was a storage facility. Children with physical or developmental disabilities were placed in a single, ill-equipped classroom with one overburdened aide. There was no physical therapy room, no accessible playground, no tailored curriculum. For many families, keeping a child home was the only perceived option. Elena's project was a direct, brick-and-mortar response to that void. The investigator included whispers from community forums. A Filipina cleaner was building a school in her backyard. Most comments were supportive, some were skeptical about permits, but one thread was universal: the desperate need it filled. Then, Michael's investigator found the zoning complaint. A neighbor, someone not involved in the community effort, had filed an anonymous report with the city's building department 2 weeks prior. The complaint cited unauthorized commercial structure in a residential zone and potential safety hazards. The city had opened a case file. An inspector was scheduled to visit in 21 days. If the structure was deemed out of compliance, the city could issue a stop work order, followed by fines Elena could never pay, and ultimately a demolition order. The clock was ticking on the walls she had laid with her own hands. Michael felt a surge of panic, immediately followed by a familiar capitalist reflex. He could fix this. He would write a check to a nonprofit, hire lawyers, navigate the permit maze, and build a state-of-the-art facility. He opened his banking app, his finger hovering over transfer. Then he stopped. The image of Elena's firm, polite refusal flashed in his mind. His money had already been declared useless. This was not his project to take over. To inject his wealth would be to colonize her act of faith, to turn a community's grassroots answer into another one of his charitable tax write-offs. He was paralyzed between the urge to save and the fear of disrespecting the very dignity he admired. He needed to see more to understand the heart of it. The following evening, he positioned himself earlier, catching the shift change. He saw Elena arrive, but she didn't go to the construction site immediately. She walked to the front porch of the small house where an elderly woman in a wheelchair was waiting. Elena knelt, spoke softly, and adjusted the woman's blanket. Then she went inside and emerged with a tray of food. This was her mother, the investigators' notes had mentioned, who had suffered a stroke. The care was continuous, a flowing stream from her paid work to her community work to her family. As the volunteers gathered, a new vehicle arrived, a modest sedan. A woman got out, helping a boy of about 8 who walked with forearm crutches. The boy's face, visible in the porch light, was alight with excitement. He navigated the uneven path toward the unfinished building with determined concentration. This was Matteo, Michael would later learn. His mother, Lucia, was a hotel housekeeper. Matteo had cerebral palsy. The existing school system offered him a bus ride to a specialized school 45 minutes away, a journey that exhausted him before his day began. The Mariposa Center was to be his chance at an education just blocks from home. Michael watched as Elena greeted them. She didn't pat the boy on the head. She shook his hand formally, then knelt to look at a drawing he pulled from his backpack, a sketch of the building with a ramp and a bright yellow door. She treated him not as a recipient of charity, but as a stakeholder, a client. This was the core of it, dignity. The weight of his own ignorance settled on him like a physical burden. For 10 years, he had paid for a service, believing the transaction was complete. He had never considered the other transactions that made her presence in his home possible, the remittances she sent overseas, the care for her mother, the silent investment in this dream. Her life was a complex, precarious ecosystem of giving, and his bonus was an asteroid threatening to throw its delicate balance into chaos. She couldn't accept a sudden windfall because it would disrupt the moral economy of her world, a world where progress was earned by sweat and shared sacrifice, not bestowed from above. But the city inspector's pending visit was a threat no amount of sweat could overcome. It was a systemic problem that required systemic knowledge, the very knowledge Michael possessed. He was a master of navigating bureaucracy, of leveraging rules, of finding the pressure points in systems. This was his domain. The question was, could he enter that domain on her terms? The answer presented itself in crisis. 3 nights later, a summer storm rolled in unexpectedly. Michael, watching a weather radar on his phone, felt a jolt of alarm. The unfinished structure had no roof, only tarps lashed over the walls. Torrential rain and wind could collapse the freshly laid masonry. He drove to Crestwood through the downpour, his windshield wipers struggling. When he turned onto her street, his headlights illuminated a scene of frantic activity. Elena and 2 other volunteers were battling the storm, trying to secure flapping tarps with ropes and bricks. The wind was winning. A large section of tarp tore free, exposing a vulnerable wall to the horizontal rain. Michael didn't think. He parked and ran into the chaos. He grabbed a corner of the runaway tarp, his dress shoes slipping in the mud. Elena, soaked to the skin, turned and saw him. In the flashing glare of the lightning, her expression was unreadable, shock, confusion, perhaps a flicker of betrayal. There was no time for explanations. For 20 minutes, they fought the storm together, a billionaire and a housekeeper, wrestling with plastic and rope in the mud. When the worst of the rain passed, they stood in the dripping quiet, panting. The building was damaged, but saved. The volunteers murmured thanks and headed to their cars. Elena and Michael were left alone in her waterlogged backyard. "You followed me," she said, her voice flat. "It wasn't a question." "I did," Michael admitted, wiping mud from his hands. "I was confused, and then I was amazed." She looked at the wounded structure, then back at him. "So now you know my secret, and you see it is a foolish one, a pile of bricks in the rain." "It's not foolish," he said, the conviction in his own voice surprising him. "It's the most logical thing I've ever seen. You identified a problem, and you are building the solution. It's what I do, but you're doing it without capital." She studied him, her guard still up, but her curiosity piqued. "Why are you here tonight, Mr. Thorne? To offer your money again?" The answer is still no. "I'm not here to offer money," he said, and the words felt profoundly true as he spoke them. "I'm here to offer information. You have a zoning problem. A city inspector is coming in less than 3 weeks." The color drained from Elena's face. The storm had been a visible enemy. This was a hidden one, far more dangerous. Her defiance wavered, replaced by a look of deep exhaustion. This was the wall she knew she couldn't scale with bricks and mortar. "I see," she whispered. "Let me help," Michael said, choosing his words with more care than he ever had in a boardroom. "Not with my checkbook, with my experience. I know how to talk to these people. I know what paperwork they need to see. Let me help you navigate this. As a consultant, pro bono." He held his breath. This was the pivot. He was not offering a donation. He was offering his labor, his skill. It was the only currency that might be acceptable in her economy. Elena looked at her hands, caked in mud and mortar. She looked at the building, her dream standing vulnerable in the night. She looked at this man who paid her salary, who had invaded her privacy, and who was now standing in her mud, offering a different kind of hand. "Okay," she said, the word so quiet it was almost lost in the dripping trees. "Okay, we will talk tomorrow." But as Michael drove home, a new fear gripped him. He had gained a fragile entry point, but the battle with the city was just one front. What he didn't know, what Elena had never told a soul, was the true, personal origin story of the Mariposa Center. It wasn't just born from seeing a community need. It was forged in a personal loss so profound that its shadow touched every brick. And as Michael would soon learn, that history contained a heartbreaking connection to his own world of wealth and privilege, a connection that would make his mission not just an act of help, but an absolute moral imperative. The next afternoon, Michael returned to Crestwood not as a hidden observer, but as an invited guest. He found Elena in her small, immaculate living room, surrounded by notebooks and sketches. What began as a strategy session would become a confession, unearthing a tragedy that tied their two worlds together in a way Michael could never have imagined. They started with the practical. Michael, using his laptop, navigated the city's labyrinthine permitting portal. He explained the difference between a community facility and an accessory dwelling unit and the specific variances they would need. Elena listened intently, her notes meticulous. She had already filled out 3 incorrect applications, she admitted, each rejected with opaque bureaucratic language. The system was designed to be navigated by experts, by people who could afford lawyers and expeditors, people like him. As they worked, Michael noticed a framed photograph on a side table. It showed a younger Elena, her arm around a beaming boy of about 10 in a wheelchair. The boy's smile was luminous, his eyes bright with intelligence. Elena saw him looking. She paused, then picked up the frame. "This is my brother Gabriel," she said, her voice softer. "He was the reason, the first reason." Gabriel had been born with spinal muscular atrophy. Their family had immigrated when he was 5, seeking better medical care. But the better care they found was locked behind insurance networks and income thresholds they could never reach. Elena, even as a teenager, became his primary caregiver and fiercest advocate. She fought his school to provide basic accessibility, often carrying him upstairs herself when the elevator was, as usual, broken. "He was brilliant," Elena said, a sad smile touching her lips. "He wanted to be an architect. He drew buildings that were beautiful and full of ramps and wide doors. He designed this." She pointed to a detailed, colorful sketch pinned to the wall, the floor plan of the Mariposa Center, annotated in a child's careful printing. It was the drawing he had seen Matteo holding. Gabriel had died at 16 from a respiratory infection that became catastrophic because the family's overcrowded, damp apartment exacerbated his condition. The hospital's social worker had once mentioned a charity that provided air filtration systems for children with his condition, but the application was 30 pages long and required a doctor's ongoing certification they couldn't afford. He did not die from his disease, Elena said, her gaze steady on Michael. He died from the complications of being poor. There is a difference. Michael felt the air leave his lungs. This was the bedrock of her resolve. This was the fire. But then Elena delivered the revelation that would connect their histories with a sickening click. In the months after Gabriel's death, drowning in grief and medical debt, Elena had taken a second job cleaning offices downtown. One of her regular clients was a sleek venture capital firm. Late one night, emptying trash bins, she had overheard a boisterous conversation between two young associates. They were celebrating a massive exit, the sale of a medical device startup they had funded. The startup's flagship product was a home monitoring system for patients with neuromuscular diseases. The associates joked about the gold mine of selling direct-to-consumer to desperate families at a 500% markup. One of them scoffed at the idea of making it affordable through insurance, calling it a charity, not a business. That startup, Elena learned, was called Oramed, and one of its earliest angel investors, a name mentioned with reverence in that office, was Michael Thorne. She had come home that night, looked at a photo of Gabriel, and knew the system that had failed her brother was not some abstract, faceless entity. It was built and profited from by the very people whose spaces she cleaned. The bonus Michael tried to give her wasn't just generosity. It was, in her mind, a fragment of the same profit model that had viewed her brother's life as a market segment. "I do not blame you, Mr. Thorne," she said, watching the shock and dawning horror on his face. "You did not make my brother sick, but your world made his life a transaction. I cannot take money from that system to fix the problems it creates. It would make his memory a transaction too." Michael was speechless. The moral clarity of her position was a shattering force. He had seen Oramed as a smart bet on innovative healthcare. He had never once, not in a single board meeting or report, considered the actual cost of its pricing strategy, the human cost. It had been an Excel spreadsheet, and now he was sitting with its consequence. This was the true, unbridgeable gulf between them, and it was why his help with the zoning forms felt like both a lifeline and a profound hypocrisy. Yet the work continued. They filed the corrected variance applications together. Michael used his network not to donate money, but to get a pro bono structural engineer to sign off on the building plans, satisfying a key city requirement. They were making progress. But the anonymous complainer was not finished. A week later, a local news van showed up on Elena's street. A reporter, tipped off about a zoning war, began knocking on doors, asking leading questions about property values and safety. The story that aired that evening was a masterpiece of skewed framing. It presented Elena as a well-intentioned but possibly naive immigrant, building without permits, and portrayed the anonymous complaint as a concerned neighbor worried about neighborhood character. It barely mentioned the children it was for. The backlash was immediate and ugly, online comment sections filled with vitriol. A community meeting was called by a newly formed neighborhood association, led by people who had never volunteered a day in Crestwood. Michael attended, standing in the back of a crowded church basement. He listened as person after person, many from adjacent, wealthier neighborhoods, spoke about maintaining standards and the slippery slope of allowing this. They used words like liability and precedent. They talked about the children as those kids, their needs framed as a burden. Elena sat in the front row, her back straight, saying nothing. The anger in the room was a cold, polite thing, far more intimidating than shouting. It was the sound of systemic exclusion being politely enforced. Then an older man in a sweater vest stood. He identified himself as a retired city planner. He presented what seemed like a death blow. Even if the zoning variance was approved, he explained, the city's building code for educational facilities required specific, costly upgrades, a commercial-grade fire suppression system, asbestos abatement certification for the land, and parking lot paving. The costs would exceed $200,000. Requirements, he said smugly, that were non-negotiable for the safety of the children. The room fell silent. It was a checkmate by bureaucracy. The volunteers looked devastated. Elena closed her eyes. But Michael felt a different emotion cut through the despair, a cold, familiar fury. He recognized this move. It was a tactic he'd used in business, burying a competitor in regulatory overhead. This wasn't about safety. This was about making the project impossible. As the meeting adjourned, Michael watched the retired planner shake hands with a well-dressed woman who had been observing quietly. The woman looked familiar. It took Michael a moment to place her, Catherine Vance, a real estate developer known for buying up distressed lots and building luxury townhomes. She had tried to partner with his firm on a project years ago. He declined. Her methods were aggressive. He connected the dots with a sinking heart. The anonymous complaint, the media tip, this sudden mobilization of concerned neighbors, it was a squeeze play. Catherine Vance wanted the land. The school was in her way. She was using the city's own rules to crush it. Michael caught up to Elena outside. The defeat on her face was absolute. "It is over," she said quietly. "They have found a rule for every brick. We cannot fight the rules." "We can," Michael said, a plan crystallizing with brutal clarity, "but not by playing their game on this field. They are using the rules as a weapon. We have to change the game." "How?" Elena asked, exhaustion in every syllable. "We take the story public. The real story, not the zoning story. The story of Gabriel, the story of Matteo, the story of why this building must exist. We show the city that the cost of saying no isn't a blot on a map. It's a sentence on these children's futures. We make it politically impossible for them to hide behind the rulebook." Elena shook her head, fear in her eyes. "No more reporters. They twist everything." "This time," Michael said, "you will do the talking, not me, not them, you, and you will not be alone." He pulled out his phone and sent a single text. It was to a woman named Sarah Lynn, an award-winning documentary filmmaker he had funded years ago on a whim. Her latest film about housing inequality had just premiered to critical acclaim. Her reply was almost instant. "I'm on a plane, tell me where to be." Michael looked back at Elena. "We have a voice, now we need a stage, and I know just where to find one." But as they prepared to pivot from a defensive battle to a public offensive, none of them knew that Catherine Vance was already 2 steps ahead. She had just secured a private meeting with the most powerful person on the city's zoning board. And she was bringing with her not just financial incentives, but a piece of information about Michael Thorne's own past that could discredit him and his advocacy in an instant, turning their moral stand into a public scandal. The final battle for the Mariposa Center would not be fought with bricks or permits, but in the brutal arena of reputation, where Michael's fortune would be his greatest liability. The battle for the Mariposa Center moved from backyards and basements to the glaring light of public scrutiny. Sarah Lynn, the filmmaker, arrived with a small crew and a simple directive: listen. For 3 days, she filmed the quiet rhythm of Elena's life, the early morning bus ride, the care for her mother, the evening shift at the construction site, and the hopeful faces of the children waiting for their school. She filmed Matteo practicing writing his name on a makeshift chalkboard, his tongue between his teeth in concentration. She filmed Lucia, his mother, speaking through tears about the exhaustion of their 45-minute bus journey to the distant, impersonal special needs school. "I just want him to have a chance to be tired from learning," she said, "not from traveling." The raw footage was cut into a 15-minute segment, but before it could be released, Catherine Vance made her move. A sleek, confidential dossier was delivered to every member of the city's zoning board and leaked to a prominent business journalist. Its headline was designed to detonate: "Philanthropy or Penance? Tech Millionaire's Hidden Ties to Disability Profiteering." The report meticulously detailed Michael's early investment in Oramed, complete with internal projections that celebrated the high-margin sustainability of selling to captive patient populations. It juxtaposed this with Gabriel's story, implying Michael's sudden advocacy was not altruism, but a calculated effort to launder a guilty conscience. The final line was a masterstroke of character assassination. Is Michael Thorne saving a school or simply buying a new reputation? The effect was immediate and brutal. The zoning board president, a political operator wary of controversy, postponed the public hearing indefinitely. The news story ran, and the online narrative flipped overnight. Michael was painted as a hypocrite, and by association, the Mariposa Center was framed as his vanity project, a rich man's guilt-eraser built on the back of a grieving sister. Michael was devastated. He called Alina, his voice thick with shame. "I've destroyed it. My past, it's poisoned everything. I should step back." There was a long silence on the line. Then Alina spoke, her voice clear and firm. "No, that is what she wants. If you step back, she wins. You told me to tell my story. My story includes this. It is the whole truth." Alina made a decision. She asked Sarah Lynn to add the Oramed revelation to the film, to include the photograph of Gabriel, to show the full, uncomfortable circle. "We cannot fight a lie with a half-truth," she said. The revised film was released not to news outlets, but directly on social media with a simple caption, "The Full Story." It began with Gabriel's smile. It showed his architectural drawings. It detailed his death and the overheard conversation at the venture firm. And then, with unflinching clarity, it showed Alina sitting at her kitchen table, looking directly into the camera. "The man who invested in that company is now helping me fight for this school. I have made my peace with that contradiction, because people are not one thing. Systems are cruel, but people can change. He is not funding this school. He is fighting for it. There is a difference. Do not let them use my brother's memory to stop these children from having what he never did." It was a staggering act of public forgiveness and strategic brilliance. The video went viral, not as a scandal, but as a profound lesson in redemption and complex humanity. The public sentiment, fueled by the raw power of Alina's narrative, turned like a tide. The city's inboxes flooded with messages. Parents of children with disabilities from across the region shared their own struggles. The story was no longer about zoning, it was about justice. Under this intense spotlight, the zoning board was forced to reinstate the public hearing. The chamber was packed, with news cameras lining the walls. Catherine Vance attended, her lawyer by her side, confident the technical requirements were still insurmountable. Alina spoke first. She did not plead, she presented. She showed Gabriel's drawings, now blown up on a poster board. She introduced Mateo and Lucia and 2 other families. She presented a petition signed by over 300 local residents. Her voice never wavered. "You have many rules about bricks and pavement," she concluded. "But what is your rule for a child's future? Where is that written?" Then Michael stood to speak. He acknowledged his investment in Oramed without defensiveness. "The report you received was correct in its facts, but blind to its point. I am here precisely because I have seen the distance between a profit margin and a human life. I am not here as an investor. I am here as a witness to a better model, one built not on extraction, but on community." Then he pivoted, addressing the retired planner's safety concerns. He presented a new set of documents, stamped and signed. The pro bono structural engineer had not only approved the plans, but had connected them with a nonprofit that installs fire safety systems in community centers at cost. A local concrete company, owned by a man whose nephew had Down syndrome, had offered to donate the paving for a small accessible parking area. The insurmountable $200,000 hurdle had been solved not with a check, but with a network activated by the story, not the money. Catherine Vance's lawyer stood to reiterate the strict letter of the law, but the political calculus had changed. One by one, zoning board members, sensing the public mood, began to speak. They talked about community value, about adaptive solutions, and the spirit of the code. When the vote came, it was unanimous. A conditional use permit was granted for the Mariposa Center, with a timeline to meet the adapted safety requirements. The victory in the chamber was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, something extraordinary happened. Donations began to arrive at a post office box Alina had set up. They were not large checks from corporations. They were $20 bills from teachers, $50 from nurses, $5 from a disability pensioner with a note that read, "For Gabriel." A hardware store chain, inspired by the story, donated all the remaining materials. Volunteer contractors offered their weekends. Michael, respecting Alina's boundaries, did not write a check. Instead, he used his most valuable asset, his time. He became the project's unofficial logistics coordinator, navigating supply chains and volunteer schedules with the same focus he once applied to mergers. He learned to lay mortar beside her, his expensive clothes permanently stained with clay. The school was completed in 4 months. The opening day was a neighborhood festival. The yellow door from Mateo's drawing was real. Children in wheelchairs raced down the smooth, paved ramp for the first time. The single classroom was bright, adaptable, and filled with donated equipment tailored for different needs. At the ribbon cutting, Elena asked Michael to say a few words. He stood before the crowd, looking at the faces of the families, the volunteers, and at Elena, who gave him a small, firm nod. "I came here to give a bonus," he said, his voice catching, "and I was given an education instead. This building," he gestured behind him, "is not a charity, it is an accounting. It is the community's answer to a bill that should never have come due. My job was just to help clear the bureaucratic weeds so the real builders could get to work." But the final, surprising detail emerged quietly weeks later. As Michael was helping file the final occupancy paperwork, he discovered the official land title. He had assumed the small house and lot were in Elena's name. They were not. The title was held in a slender, rust-colored file folder in Elena's cabinet. The owner of record was a family trust, established 5 years prior. The beneficiaries were not listed as individuals, but as a purpose, for the operation of an educational facility serving disabled children in the Crestwood community. And the settlor, the person who had placed the land into the trust, was not Elena. It was her mother, Consuelo. The deed was dated just after Gabriel's death. With the last of her savings and with a profound foresight, the elderly woman in the wheelchair had bought this modest plot, not as an inheritance for her daughter, but as a seed. She had planted it, and her daughter had watered it with a decade of labor, so that one day children like her son would have a place to grow. Michael realized then that the true fortune had never been his. It was this: a mother's foresight, a sister's fidelity, and a community's willingness to bend its back to a common good. He had not been a savior. He had been a tool, borrowed for a time, to help complete a design that was envisioned long before he arrived. And in that humbling truth, he found a peace his millions had never bought. Mariposa Center now stands, a living rebuttal to the world of transactions. And every Thursday, Elena still arrives at Michael's home to clean. The dynamic between them is forever altered. They are no longer just employer and employee. They are co-conspirators in a quiet understanding of what truly builds a world worth living in. The refusal of that bonus was not an end. It was an invitation to look beyond the price tag and to finally see the priceless architecture of the human heart. The story of Michael and Elena is more than a tale of unexpected charity. It is a map of 2 different worlds of value and a lesson in what truly builds a legacy that lasts. For a decade, Michael measured progress in quarterly reports and stock valuations. He believed growth was a line on a chart, moving upward and to the right. Elena measured progress in the height of a brick wall, in the confidence of a child who mastered a new word, in the quiet solidarity of neighbors sharing their evenings. Her growth was circular, rippling outward, strengthening a community's roots. We live in a society that often sees the world through Michael's initial lens. We celebrate the grand gesture, the large donation, the disruptive innovation. We are taught that scale is the ultimate metric of success. But the Mariposa Center asks a different question. What is the scale of a human life? What is the return on investment for a child who no longer feels like a burden, but like a citizen, for a mother who can work without the crushing anxiety of her child's well-being? Elena's refusal of the bonus was not a rejection of help. It was a defense of a principle. In a system that reduces human dignity to a transaction, her labor, her care, her brother's memory, these things were not for sale. They were the foundation upon which everything else had to be built. She understood that when money enters a story too early, it can rewrite the entire plot, turning participants into beneficiaries and turning agency into dependency. Michael's journey was from being a financier to becoming a facilitator. His greatest contribution was not his wealth, but his willingness to become a tool in someone else's hands, to listen, to follow, and to use his specific knowledge to clear obstacles, not to dictate the path. In the end, he did not fund a school. He defended a dream. and in doing so, he earned a place in a story bigger than his own. There are Elenas all around us, the quiet caregivers, the essential workers, the neighbors who hold the fabric of our communities together with relentless, undervalued labor. They are not waiting for a savior or a bonus. They are building, brick by patient brick, the world they know is possible. Our choice is whether we see them as service providers or as the architects of our collective future. The miracle of this story is not that a rich man helped a maid. The miracle is that he was humble enough to let her teach him what help actually looks like. It is a reminder that the most profound transformations often begin not with writing a check, but with asking a simple, honest question: what are you building, and how can I help you carry the next brick? If this story revealed a new perspective to you, share it with someone who might need to see the world through a different lens. For more journeys into the human heart, subscribe and join us next time. Remember, the most important foundations are often poured in silence, long before the world ever thinks